Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Romina Bandura. I'm a senior fellow here at the Project on Prosperity and Development. And today I have the pleasure to be moderating this distinguished panel on debt transparency in developing countries. Thank you for the in-person audience on a wet and Friday afternoon. And for those watching us online, we'll be posting this event afterwards. So I was joking that you can, watch it instead of watching, Netflix tonight. You can rewatch the video of this event. So we have a very distinguished panel, and I'll introduce our expert shortly. But I just wanted to give a little bit of, a landscape of the issues we're dealing with. I know there's been a lot of discussion on global public goods, or I would say global public bads, and the international financial institutions, especially climate change and pandemics. But financial stability is also a global public good, and today we're going to be talking mainly on that, but also on issues of development, because according to UNDP, today there are about 54 low and middle income countries that have severe debt problems. Indebtedness has reached very high levels, unprecedented levels, and this not only impacts, should there be, a lot of debt workouts, hopefully, but a wave of defaults. This not only impacts financial stability, but it also impacts development as well, because I'll just throw another figure out there that I read. A study by Debt Justice found that low-income countries are spending about 16% of their, revenues in debt servicing. That means, they can't pay for things like health, education, and things that, we care about. And what has changed in the last 25 years is not only, that we have, technology now and civil society, but the creditors have changed, right? So a lot of the debt is sitting, I would say, or it's financed by China, and a lot of the debt is also held by private bondholders. And there has been, a lot of talks and initiatives to work out these issues. But I would say, and I have Doug next to me. He's an expert, so he'll talk a little bit about what has happened on these issues. But today we want to also talk about transparency, because a lot of this debt is, how should I say it? We don't know the terms, yes, the volumes, and so how can we make debt be more transparent? And USAID has launched a new tool called the Debt Transparency Scorecard to help governments really release the information. So we'll be talking about those issues and others. And so I'm going to now introduce our wonderful panelists. To my right, I have Doug Rediker. He is non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and founding partner of International Capital Strategies, LLC. Mr. Rediker also represented the United States on the executive board of the IMF from 2010 to 2012. So welcome, Doug. To the right of Doug is Rafael Romero. He's the president and CEO of DevTech Systems. DevTech Systems is an international consulting firm that specializes in development issues and in particular quality data. If Rafael also worked at the IMF, right? So he knows a lot about fiscal affairs, and he'll be talking a little bit about his work for USAID and the IMF. Then to my left, I have DJ Nordquist. She's the Executive Vice President of the Economic Innovation Group. It's a bipartisan public policy incubator dedicated to forging a more dynamic, entrepreneurial, and innovative economy. DJ represented the US on the board of directors of the World Bank Group after being confirmed by the Senate, and she helped steer the bank's COVID response and worked with G7, G20, and Paris Club on the debt service suspension initiative. And last but not least, Mark Rosen, he's partner at Advention Growth Capital. Mark has over 2 decades of experience in the finance industry, and he'll be talking a little bit about, his perspective on these debt transparency issues. So before we go into the conversation, I'd like to give each of our speakers some minutes to set the stage. And so I'll start, Doug, with you, and then I'll turn to DJ.
Thank you very much.
Can everybody hear? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Great, thanks. So good afternoon. I wanted to set the stage here and provide an overview of where I think issues around emerging and developing market debt are right now. I'm going to leave some of the specifics of the debt transparency related issues to my fellow panelists and for the discussion to follow, and focus on the disappointing outcome of the recently concluded IMF and World Bank spring meetings. Now, the biggest question at those meetings was who was going to show up from China, and would they come bearing any new messages on any key issues? Now, PBOC Governor Yi Gang led the delegation, accompanied by the Deputy Finance Minister, and despite the headlines and suggestions that China came ready to make a deal on debt and policy-related issues, it appears China came without anything significantly new on offer. And in the run-up to the meetings, it was suggested that China might be prepared to drop its insistence on including multilateral development banks, and maybe even the IMF, in debt relief, potentially in exchange for commitments by the MDBs to provide greater concessional financing assurances in the future. In the end, however, it does not appear that significant progress was made, either on specific countries or on the broader issues of sovereign debt restructuring. There was incremental progress, but far short of hopes that China would agree on specific countries and on broader coordination. The IMF and the World Bank co-chaired a meeting of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable in an effort to facilitate these efforts and to bridge divides, which was itself seen as progress. But despite spin from many quarters, we saw little tangible progress on the big issues that remain outstanding on China's willingness to be more open, transparent, and cooperative on sovereign debt issues. This included countries in the common framework, as well as others that have not yet sought debt relief, or which are being undertaken outside of the common framework process. Everyone was glad Yi Gang was here. Yi Gang is a familiar face with decades of experience and relationships, but he is also now a transitional figure. Yi's statements and speeches asserted China's view that there are 3 creditor groups, and each needs to bear the cost of restructuring. He asserted that of the 3 creditor groups, the largest creditor group is the private sector, followed by the multilateral development banks, and lastly, by official sector bilateral creditors, of which he acknowledged China is the largest. Then he argued that in spite of the official sector representing the smallest of the 3 creditor groups, China had implemented the DSSI and provided almost half the overall debt suspension relief to date. Now, for debt restructuring to be successful, he argued, all 3 creditor groups have to make a significant contribution in a fair and transparent way, that everyone has to share the burden on an equal and comparable basis. Thus, from my perspective at least, he effectively rejected most of what the MDB's and the G20's arguments are that they should not have to participate in debt relief. Yi was relaying Beijing's position. The political powers in Beijing are focused on domestic political considerations, which makes providing meaningful debt relief to countries in sovereign debt distress very difficult. President Xi owns this issue himself. He was the father of the BRI. He does not prioritize economic and financial issues, but is rather focused on politics of power and ideology. So providing debt relief to other countries poses a precedent-setting problem for President Xi, not only internationally, but also domestically, where China still has large parts of the population living in poverty, some in worse conditions than those of countries seeking debt relief. China actually blames the sovereign debt issues of today on events and actors outside of China's control. They argue that sovereign debt became a problem due to COVID, for which they deny any responsibility, and the strength of the US dollar, which they see as a consequence of both high US interest rates and of the Russian war in Ukraine, for which they blame the US as having pushed Ukraine too far, all of which led to rising costs of sovereign debt. So to China, the message is, why do we need to clean up the mess that the US created? So my bottom line is that expectations that China is going to act constructively and transparently should be very tempered. There are hopes that progress is still possible in the coming weeks in the case of Zambia, but even that has taken way too long and remains very tenuous. As long as the international community is dependent on China's willingness to cooperate with multilateral system and to provide transparency, including on the terms of its lending, including in particular on collateral and escrow accounts and other opaque structures, debt relief for developing and emerging countries is likely to be much slower, more difficult, and more costly. It is easy to blame the private sector for refusing to provide debt relief, but today the private sector has actually been a constructive actor. The issue has been how to define comparable treatment with China when China has been neither forthcoming nor fully aligned in interests with any of the other actors at the table. China is both a necessary actor and the major impediment to progress on debt-related issues. I hope that we can explore some of these issues in the discussion to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. DJ?
Great. I agree with most of what you said. I do think it's interesting that China has, taken this position that, they're the victim. When you look at, debt, it's about 300 trillion globally in 2022, so that's about 338% of global GDP. Interestingly, it actually dropped in 2021, but it dropped in the wrong places. It was the developed countries where the debt load dropped, and it increased in the developing countries. The progress at the spring meetings, it was nothing to write home about. The interesting part was that China, claimed to concede at the end that they would drop their demand for the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, to have to take a haircut. In exchange for more money going from the African Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank to the developing world, which I can't figure out what the game is there. Maybe you guys can figure it out, other than China gets the vast majority of procurement from all the multilateral development banks, so this is money in their pocket. I don't think that they actually really care about helping those countries. I do think it's actually really interesting. Obviously China is now the world's largest creditor, and that's a choice, as Doug said, that they made themselves. I kind of wonder, if the government in China's, that there's maybe this bifurcation between MOFCOM and the Ministry of Finance, the money guys, where they actually want to be paid back, right? And then you have sort of the PLA and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where I think they're happy if these countries default because they want to seize the asset. So I'd love to be a fly on the wall if those ministries are actually talking to each other. I saw, by the way, I tried to find what China's total debt is, because we're talking about money that countries owe China. China actually has a huge debt load. I saw many different numbers. The one that I'm going to go with this one because I like big numbers, 52 trillion. So 52 trillion, that's, that's both public and private debt. So think about that for a second. Like 52 trillion, like we in the United States, we're at like 31 trillion. Our economy is bigger. If that number is right, I mean, that's like 3 times 300, 3 times their GDP. And that's if you believe what their GDP is, right? So I'd love to know who believes the official Chinese numbers as to how fast their economy is growing. There was a really good University of Chicago paper late last year where they, did one of those light studies where they measured, economic activity by light, and they think that China's economy is actually 60% smaller than what they say it is. So that's fascinating. Doug talked about how China does have like pockets of poverty. Again, if you look at the official numbers, China claims that fewer than 1% of their people are in poverty, which is how they get away with taking money from the World Bank, even though they are technically a developed country. And that's a whole nother conversation. And then like there's sort of a question about, measurement, like how do you measure debt? Obviously the World Bank under Carmen Reinhart and David Malpass, tried very hard to try to measure debt, and as the expression goes, what gets measured gets done. But again, like there's some estimates I saw that it's about 800 billion for BRI. Carmen, before she came to the World Bank, had the number at 1.5 trillion to 150 countries. IIF says it's 5.6 trillion. So, I mean, that's a huge range. Mentioning Zambia is interesting because the president of Zambia came out, I think, right before the meetings and said, like, I just want to duck. This is like a fight between the U.S. and China. And I was thinking to myself, why are you implicating the United States? Like, the vast majority of our help to these countries is aid. It's not grants. So I don't really think this is, I didn't really think, sorry? Not loans. China doesn't give money because they because they just feel like giving money away because they want to help people. That is clearly not the case. And I think we really need to think about, in general, why these countries go to China. And it's because it's really hard to work with the World Bank, which is the one I'm more familiar with, or the IMF. There's a lot of conditionality, put on these loans. The World Bank, it can take 2 to 3 years just to get a project through. And there are these nasty little things called, ESG and things like that. And, if a country doesn't want to deal with that, China will give you a loan in like a month, no questions asked. And so a lot of these countries don't really know, what they're getting into. So anyway, I'll close it there.
Okay, thank you, DJ. Mark?
Thank you. So I was the US Executive Director of the IMF until a couple of years ago, and I haven't been back in Washington now for 2 years. And it's kind of...
We missed you.
It's good to be back. And it's kind of interesting that very little, I was there for a couple of years, and frankly, Doug, you're right in many regards that not much has changed in 2 years. The amount of progress on this China debt issue has been quite disappointing. Having said that, as I prepared for this panel and started to chat around and dig around as to what actually is going on, I think perhaps the situation is a little bit more, perhaps slightly more optimistic. I agree with you, Doug, that we need to be cynical, and certainly there isn't any public indications from the Chinese that they are changing their minds and moving to a more compromising position. But I think there is more going on behind the scenes than perhaps we know publicly. And I think, first of all, the Global Sovereign Debt Advisory Council, it seems from what I picked up that the Chinese now have accepted that there should not be concessions from the IMF and the World Bank in terms of debt write-offs, even if the Chinese and private sector creditors and others and the Paris Club gives it. They recognize that makes no sense. And I think the point that was put to them is that, do we want to go back to HIPC, where the World Bank and the IMF did give write-offs, but they were 90% write-offs. I think once they understood that, they realized that that was not an attractive option for China. I think, secondly, I think, you know, there is a lot of communication going on behind the scenes between the international financial institutions and China in trying to persuade them that if there isn't some progress made on these issues, then they will be named and shamed, as they should be. And they should be named and shamed by the international financial institutions. They should be named and shamed by us, the United States, by our European partners and creditors. More difficult, of course, for the borrowers to do that. They're always very cautious. So I think, you know, as I say, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think one of the things that I remember talking to the Chinese executive director of the IMF, and I'm hearing this is still their position, is that they feel that it's not that they don't want to take, this is the position they give to us. They don't want to, it's not they don't want to take a write-off, they want to push forward the debts out and extend the debts so they don't have to take an apparent write-off. In other words, what I would call sort of extend and pretend, really, where they where there is a reduction in net present value. I think that's reasonable. It happened in Greece. The Germans took that position. In Greece, they didn't want debt write-offs, and they pushed back their debt payments and interest payments, and that did satisfy the situation in Greece. So I think that's a reasonable, potentially a reasonable way forward. What happens if Doug is right? And in fact, they don't give the kind of concessions that we're hoping, and the pressure doesn't work. Well, one option is lending into arrears. That's a policy of the IMF that's been used. It was used more recently in the case of Suriname. But it wasn't used well. In fact, sadly, Suriname somehow, though they agreed not to pay China, they actually did make a couple of payments to China during the life of the IMF program. And they sort of argued these were mistakes or they shouldn't have happened, but unfortunately they did. And then there are arguments at the end, what happens if a program ends and then China's debt is still out there, and then we've taken write-offs, the Paris Club has taken write-offs, the private sector creditors have taken write-off, and China's debt remains out there intact, and then they get paid. That doesn't seem fair either. So lending into arrears that, frankly, when I was at the IMF, I was pretty interested in as a concept. I'm starting to worry that maybe it doesn't work as well. So this is not an easy problem to solve. I think that, again, if we don't get progress soon from the Chinese, then the US, Europeans, and the international financial institutions need to call China out and say that the reason there is no debt restructuring in Zambia or in Ethiopia or in Chad or wherever or Ghana or wherever it should be happening, and many other countries, as I expect to happen over the next several months and years, then it is China's responsibility. They are the cause of this. We have to call them out. But it's not an easy problem to solve, and I look forward to discussing it further in the panel.
Thank you. Raphael?
First of all, thank you, CSIS, and this very distinguished panel. I am coming at this issue from a very complementary perspective to the comments that you've all made, but from the foreign assistance perspective. And the reason that is important is because my firm does the official reporting for the United States government to the Congress, and we produce foreignassistance.gov. And we have noticed this discussion of debt and this new kind of crisis. This is not, we tweeted out the other day, if you're restructuring the debt of Argentina, USAID financing as a financing item of your problem, of your external financing gap, is an afterthought. But when you go into Malawi, when you go into Zambia, when you go into these places in Africa, the grants component, the foreign assistance component, is a very large component. If you look at the review of Malawi's program, the most recent review that's available on the internet, on the IMF webpage, they have an $841 million financing gap for Malawi. It's about 8% of GDP for them. 4% of it is prospective debt restructuring. 4% of it is prospective grants. They've already brought in other grants into that. So this is new grants, not on top of, for Malawi, the 12% of GDP or so that the US plows into that country every year. And foreign assistance is a strategic and vital part of US foreign policy, and we need to protect it. We need to protect the investments that the United States is doing around the world, and especially in these new kinds of debt crises that we're facing, because after 15 years of 0% interest rate, essentially, you have the financial markets that have pushed out to these frontier markets. So it's no longer Argentina, it is now Zambia. And that's where we see our work come in through USAID is we need more debt transparency. We need to strengthen these governments to confront the Lazards, to confront the creditor committees, to confront China will bring the best negotiating teams in the world. And these countries in many cases can't even produce reliable debt statistics either because they don't have the willingness or they don't have the ability. And so USAID, if it is really plowing that kind of money into these countries, which is a laudable position that was taken intentionally as grant funding. After HIPC, the United States forgave a lot of debt and continued to fund these very poor countries in significant ways, PEPFAR being Exhibit A, and didn't take a penny of claims against the grants that they gave. And now what you have is massive investments were made in these countries, and somehow they're over-leveraged to the point where a new HIPC is needed. And if we were to go in, just to give a very simple example, and we're going to publish something on this in the coming days, hopefully, there is this fantastic paper by Carmen Reinhardt that just came out that shows that China is doing rescue loans through swap lines, through emergency loans to countries. Through our database at DevTech, we can take the exact amount of grant funding that the United States did to these countries in those same years in the same countries, for USAID eligible countries, and we can show that it is equivalent, if not larger, and we will show. So where China is rescuing these countries with $100 billion, the US for the same countries in the same year put more money in. And grants are a financing item of the financing gap. And I don't want to get into the details because, I mean, the four of us, the five of us will understand it, but we're going to put people to sleep. The important thing is
If we haven't already.
foreign assistance goes into these countries. It is not easy, but it is fungible, and you can use it eventually to misallocate the funding towards Chinese debt service. And as a result of that, the foreign assistance community needs to absolutely drive debt transparency and drive the strengthening of public finance in these countries, not just because it's the right thing to do, but to protect our own U.S. investments.
So coming back to the issue of, debt transparency, can you talk a little bit about, what you think, and I'm curious to hear about, because for me, the IMF would be the natural institution pushing, on debt, not only sustainability, but transparency in the future. So I know you've done work for USAID on this new tool, and I wanted to hear, from the other, you worked at the World Bank, you both worked at the IMF, so how can we move the needle on, the debt transparency issue?
Well, one issue, and I'll defer to the panel on this, but one issue that I thought was absolutely fascinating is that in March or May of 2022, depending on which document you look at, the IMF revised its lending into arrears policy and lending into official arrears. And one of the pillars of it is better transparency around debt, because you have to demonstrate a good faith effort under that policy that you are trying to reach an agreement. So for the broader audience, the IMF, a country goes into a crisis, it needs to borrow to get through it. The IMF says, well, but you owe all these other countries money. How do I know I'm going to get paid back? How do I know? They need financing assurances, and the exact language that they use is, I believe, credible and specific written assurance from the official bilateral creditors that, yes, we won't come back at them later because we're all going to agree to sign on to the IMF program over the long term to do better growth and so on. one of the pillars of that is better debt transparency. And so I think the IMF is, their heart's in the right place. They're driving better debt transparency. I don't know if we're going to get there just on the basis of IMF conditionality. I think if that were the case, we would have gotten there already, because there's been a conditionality for 40 years in emerging market countries, and you still have debt transparency issues. So it's a struggle. But I would defer to the panel.
And going back to your point, on we call them out, we call China out, and then what?
Hopefully that will make an impact. I mean, they apparently, and I've seen it at the IMF, to be honest with you, the US didn't call China out very frequently at the board of the IMF. I was the first executive director to actually call China out on the China debt issues with the approval of the Treasury. And funnily enough, immediately at the end of that board meeting, I got a call from the Chinese executive director asking to meet with me. And he sat down with me for a couple of hours and we talked about the issues, and he said he would go back to Beijing to discuss it. And obviously not much happened, because frankly, all the people that we speak to in the central bank, all these people and the officials that they send to Washington are all on the more reasonable side of this debate. They're not the decision makers. As Doug says, this is Belt and Road. It goes all the way to President Xi, and it goes to the embarrassment that the development banks and all these other institutions that lend internationally from China feel about taking debt write-offs. It's an embarrassment. They've failed, and so they have to take a write-off. They don't want to do it, and they have to go and then admit it to their seniors. So it's not easy, but I think that they don't like to be called out, and they do seem to move a little bit, and let's see how much. Nobody has done it yet, remember. Yeah. The IMF has never called China out. The World Bank has never called China out. When they make these statements, you'll see they don't even mention China in their statements.
Called them out, right, when she went to Africa? And
I was going to say, really. Mark, I'm going to push back, because not only has Georgieva pushed back explicitly on China, but certainly David has at the bank. Yeah. But I would also say Olaf Scholz, Emmanuel Macron, President Biden in Bali. What you're describing was maybe 18 months ago.
Maybe, okay.
Over the last 4, 5, 6 months, certainly before, during, and after Bali, the US and allies, including the IMF and others, have explicitly called out China. This is where I'm going to also push back and say if we called them out, maybe they would move. We have called them out, and they did nothing. And so I would say when the common refrain from the spring meetings, which I tried to address in my opening remarks, was that China came and was willing to accept this concessional financing commitment by the MDBs and the IMF that would be in exchange for them dropping their request for these MDBs to participate in debt relief. That's not actually what they said. It's what they said. But I was in some private off-the-record meetings. I talked to other people who were in the G20 finance ministry meetings, and they said that what I heard in my private meetings was verbatim what was said in the other official meetings. And they said what I mentioned in my remarks. 3 groups of creditors, we want them to participate on equal and comparable terms, including multilateral institutions. So what they are saying to the press is one thing. What they are actually saying is something quite different.
Well, I don't think that's correct. I mean, all I'm telling you is what I've heard in my own private meetings, which contradicts that they are now stepping down from that issue after having been engaged on the issue directly. And they had to be rationalized with and explained why this would be negative for China, and they would be taking a bigger write-off. So I think maybe there you're a little bit out of date, Doug.
But I mean, I also think, China putting the stipulation on the MDBs taking a haircut is ridiculous, because the MDBs, I mean, we haven't talked about that. Like, those are concessional loans, right? It's like, 50 bips above LIBOR or SOFR or whatever it is. Versus, 5%, these Chinese loans? I mean, almost usurious. And I mean, I think that China put that stipulation on there because they know that the MDBs cannot take a haircut because of, where they are in line in terms of, getting paid back, and they'd risk their, credit rating. And if the MDBs lose their good credit rating, then they're going to also not be giving out concessional loans. Like they need the cheap financing to make the system work. Cool. So, I do think we haven't really touched on corruption. We talked about it like in the pre-meeting, and I just did want to mention it was a very interesting paper that came out of the World Bank with some Scandinavian economists that the World Bank management tried to quash, and eventually it came out because the Scandinavians published it themselves like 10 months later, where it actually looked at. Because I know you were talking about like what percent of these countries' GDP is like AID money. Like there gets to a point where like when you're getting too much foreign assistance as a percent of your GDP, that's when the corruption happens. So anyway, this paper actually looked at countries where they had 1% or more of their GDP coming from the World Bank. And in those countries, it was, I think, 20 countries, they had 7% leakage, which is a nice economic term for corruption. Like 7% of the money just disappeared. And I never understood why bank management, wanted to quash the paper, because to me it's like, okay, well, we have a problem and we better fix it, versus, management was like, nothing to see here, move on. I mean, I do think like, when you're talking about this much money sloshing around in these countries, like we in the West, or at least the US, I'll not include France, we actually care about corruption, and China doesn't. And there was another actually great paper that I mentioned in my confirmation hearing, because I'm an econ dork, that looked at, it compared World Bank loans to, Chinese bilateral loans in Africa, and it found that World Bank loans were pretty much what you'd expect they were, but the Chinese loans had zero, and some negative economic development, because China is bringing in their own workers, so there are no local jobs, their environmental standards and their labor standards are terrible, so zero economic development, and the Chinese corruption spread from like that project out to the environment around it. And so, I think a lot of these countries that are in debt to China, they maybe didn't know what they were signing. I think they're learning the hard way. There was a great piece in the Wall Street Journal that sort of talked about all these problems with these BRI, projects, but they're kind of stuck with the debt. And, I do think, so going back to like calling them out, during the debt service suspension initiative, like China, so that started at the World Bank. We got it pushed through the G7. And then the idea was, start here, go to G7, push it through the G20, which of course includes China. And, China initially refused to sign on to it. And, then they agreed to sign on to it and claimed that, the China Development Bank didn't have to be a part of it because it wasn't a development bank. It's like, it's development bank's in its name.
I remember that one.
So, but I mean, eventually the pressure got to them also because India helped pressure them, because India also didn't want to, believe it or not, India actually gives out a lot of money to its neighbors, comparatively for them. So anyway, the pressure did eventually work. So maybe eventually the pressure will work. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I wish I did.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes, Mark.
I was just going to say, I mean, you asked what do we do? What do we do if the calling out doesn't work? I suppose we do need to go back to, and I'd be interested, Doug, to hear your views on lending into arrears. You haven't commented on it, but is there a way of coming up with a system of lending into arrears that actually does work? I mean, at the moment, as I mentioned earlier, it's failed in the case of Suriname. That's the last time we did it. But maybe there's another way of going back to that, tightening the observation of these countries and what they do in terms of making payments to China, obviously, it's quite extraordinary in that case that they didn't wait to the end of the program. They actually made payments to China during the program. And they made 2 payments to China, which is rather extremely disappointing. But so the way it's structured right now does not work. But maybe there is a way of making it work. I mean, I don't know if there's another solution. Either if China doesn't agree to give debt relief, we're stuck unless we say to these countries, default on your debt to China and don't pay them, and we police it somehow.
Doug?
Well, it's the police it somehow. I mean, So I advocate lending into official arrears in a much more aggressive manner, not because there are not deep flaws, some of which you identified, some of which are others. It's not foolproof, but to some degree we don't have many other options. So Mark, your last comment was, have them default on China. Well, default is another word for arrears. So it's have them go into arrears and then police it. Well, so the steps are you have them go into arrears to China and then you continue to lend to them. That's the lending into official arrears. That's what it is, right? So the problem is, let's take Zambia. Zambia, if it were to go into official arrears to China, Zambia exports the majority of its copper to China. If China wants to put a stranglehold on Zambia's economy in response to it saying, we are not going to repay you in full and on time on the sovereign debt that you've extended to us, China, we may not like this, but it's true, has a lot of other levers it can pull. The Suriname example you gave, Mark, I made reference in my remarks to collateral and escrow. The problem without the transparency that we really all need is we don't know, so they can actually agree to put China into arrears. And we don't know if there are not bank accounts or collateral which are legally accessible by China, which allows them to be repaid anyway, right? We don't have that visibility. So to some degree, my solution is that there is no good solution. I would suggest a combination of the calling out, which hasn't worked, but saying about lending into official arrears, we're done. We are now going to do this. Now, one example of this was Sri Lanka, where you may have seen that there were some well-floated rumors that the IMF was threatening to have Sri Lanka go into official arrears to China. And miraculously, China came to the table and agreed in principle. Specific and credible is a nice bunch of words. Whether it actually means specific and credible, not so much. So what they did was under pressure because Sri Lanka is unique because India is another major creditor and there's a geopolitical battle there. So China said, okay, we will not go into the lending into official arrears scenario. We hear you. We'll give you at least on paper, or maybe at least not on paper, but in words, specific and credible assurances that we will negotiate constructively. But to date, we haven't seen anything, but I'd call that incremental progress on the back of a heavy-handed public threat to put Sri Lanka in a position where it was going to use lending into official arrears against China. Did that work? Well, a little. So what I'm not saying I have the magic bullet here because I don't think there is one. I would simply be more aggressive. I would be more assertive. I would not take at face value any of the statements that have been made because they have been largely proven to have been false, and see where we go. Because in many ways, you asked, the bank and the fund, what can they do on transparency, et cetera. I would argue that they played inverse roles of late, which is that the bank has been much more resistant to lending to countries that have Chinese exposure unless and until China says, okay, we're going to do X, Y, Z. And it is the bank that really houses the Debt Transparency Initiative, which is an enormous step forward. It is not a magic solution at all, but the fund has been much more willing to write checks and say, okay, we'll deal with the China situation later, but we got to get money into the system. I can make a case for both.
Don't you think that's because Kristalina came from the bank?
I do.
And David came from Treasury?
No, that's right. That's right. But I think to some degree, each one is struggling with this conflict. The conflict is you've got countries that are overly indebted, that need support in a crisis moment. And so should we as the multilateral system be providing that support? Answer, yes, if we can. And then you've got the point that all of us have referred to, which is, but if China is the largest official bilateral creditor and does not agree to provide support, then what you're really doing is you're giving countries money so that they can use that money to repay China, which doesn't seem like a good solution either. And if those are your only two choices, that's not a great choice for policymakers to have to make.
Does the Paris Club have anything, any action on this? I know China does not belong, but
well, the common framework is really just Paris Club plus China.
Okay.
I mean, in other occasions, Saudi and some others that are official bilateral creditors that are not Paris Club members. But the main goal of the Common Framework was to bring China into a Paris Club-like setting. One of the problems with the Common Framework is the way the Paris Club traditionally used to operate was you'd get a whole bunch of people from all the relevant countries in a physical room in Paris, you'd lock the door, and 3 days later they'd say, let me out, fine, I'll give you what you want. In the world of Zoom, what you have is an hour and a half or 2 hours of talking. You have a list of deliverables that will take place at the next meeting.
Right.
And you never get that, that forcing event that says, okay, that's it. That's why there's some hope that now that COVID is no longer an impediment to going to or coming from China, that you might see the Chinese who are interacting, engaging with Paris Club and other members in person, in the hope that maybe the personal interaction will spur some actual outcomes. But that's speculative at best.
But on the issue of, you mentioned corruption, and that's, we were talking that, common people need, the World Bank and the IMF loans, but there is a cadre of, politicians and other leaders that obviously benefit, from the opaqueness so there's
that missing 7% leakage. Where did it go? Somewhere in
Okay,
Switzerland.
well, the United States is not, the poster child either. We had COVID checks, questionable COVID checks in Afghanistan. There's also a leakage. So, I don't want to romanticize. We try to, obviously, we are, combating corruption is an important value for us and what we're doing and in our policy making, but, we're not, DJ, we're not, great either, but sorry, I cut you off.
No, I think to put a finer point on, I think what the point that DJ made on corruption is I don't think we need to look at foreign aid and say this is a waste of money because there is corruption. And this goes to the broader point of calling out China. It's that you need to fight the corruption along every step of the way. If you look at, again, because these are different kinds of crises, the biggest player in the room is not in the room, which is USAID, the Department of State's refugee funding. These are very low-income countries that have foreign assistance as a 800-pound gorilla in that country. And there is a lot of, if you want to call out China, call them out at every ministry which USAID works. The health ministry, where you're running PEPFAR. The education ministry, where you're running Let's Read, which is billions of dollars going around the world. Your humanitarian aid, drive that transparency and call them out because, he's right, the horse has left the barn on this. How do you get China to step away from arrears? By the way, the lending into official arrears policy, there's a great editorial by Sean Hagan, who used to be the counselor at the fund in the Financial Times very recently. They're not applying it. They're not. It is a political issue. They are not applying the policy. And the strict criteria that the fund should be using is, if we lend into arrears with China, can we mobilize a financing package in the future? Will China help us? Well, China does not have a proven track record, if I understood Sean Hagan's point correctly. China does not have a proven track record of delivering debt relief to countries. So who cares if in the future you also don't get debt relief from China if they're not giving it now?
The problem is that the countries themselves are not abiding by the lending into arrears policy. That's the problem.
Correct. And the fund programs are not at the board. The fund has not made that political decision. It's a very tough decision. I'm not pretending that why didn't they just do this so far. I think it's tough. I think it's a tough call. I think you're right. But could they do it? They could do it. But the consequences are what happens when the day after the program is over.
Yep.
Who's going to manage that economy? Will that country?
Or even during the program.
Exactly. Will that country stick to the assumptions of the IMF program? The answer is, if you're lending into arrears against China, probably not, because they're going to have to pay back. Somehow the Chinese will leverage their multi-pronged. They hate you. There was a great speech given. I can't remember now, so it's not worth mentioning. But the multi-dimensional approach that China takes, it's diplomatic, it's military, it's BRI, it's the Confucius Institute, they are in the woodwork, they're everywhere. My argument is the United States should do the same. There should be no daylight between Treasury, state, USAID, CDC with PEPFAR, DOD with PEPFAR, DOD with FMF and IMED and all of that, because in these countries, this is not Mexico 1982, where you've got 6 banks and Volcker's going to come in and, stomp the table and make everybody agree. That's not going to happen. And so I think the horse has left the barn in these things. And one of the few things that lending into arrears is pushing is better transparency so we can get a grip on, the fact that we have the world's best researchers, for example, Carmen Reinhardt, producing papers just so we can get a handle on what has China actually lent is just a headline grabbing red flag that we don't know what is going on the ground in Zambia, in Chad. And by the way, not just China. Let's talk, Glencore, et cetera. These guys are there, but China is much larger, I would argue. But nonetheless, you got to go country by country. In Ghana, it's not necessarily China. There's a lot of commercial lenders. So how did they end up in this position? Do we have the data? Do we know what's going on? Because it is not going to be, a smoke-filled room with 3 guys smoking cigars talking to Citibank to resolve Brady bonds as a way out. I don't see that in this new crisis. And it's huge, and it's 60% of the low-income countries, and it's where, the mining resources are, and it's where we need to go, and we're not winning this battle right now by having this bifurcation of, it's the IMF, and then foreign aid is an afterthought.
And again, I just want to go back to my earlier point, we really need to think about, why are these countries going to China? What can we do to make ourselves more attractive? The World Bank, the IMF, the World Bank's going through this evolution roadmap. The World Bank went through reforms, 2 decades ago, where there was a decision to be more client-centric, where the sovereigns were going to push what they were looking for up. And I don't see that happening. I think we're reversing, where you have the West saying, we will only be the bank of climate change. And by the way, we should be talking about climate change, but it's a development bank. And if you look at the Breakthrough Institute went through and did an analysis of the client, the country, the sovereign surveys, and they all listed education as their most important issue, and it went through, and I think climate change was number 20. So, China doesn't care about climate change. China's building 2 new coal plants a week. These countries will take it.
That's a good point.
Are there any leverage points? I know also China, borrows from the World Bank and the IMF. I probably not, not a lot in terms of their.
A lot. It's
over
a billion
for
a
the
year.
World Bank. But for them, are there any other entry points that we could, use to help resolve the situation with China?
When you say entry points, what do you mean?
Or carrots and sticks, let's say, with China through the MDB system.
Yes, they should be forced to graduate. Unfortunately, graduation is voluntary. China has met all 3 criteria to graduate. And they're not dumb. They're getting, $1 billion, $1.1 billion a year just at IBRD. They get somewhere between 500 and 800 from IFC.
But frankly, those amounts are so small in relation to their economy. I don't think it really matters, TJ. I don't think even if we cut that,
except that it's not just the money; it's that they're taking the expertise.
I fully agree. It's wrong, and it should stop. But
they should be embarrassed to be taking it.
Of course
either you're taking money from the World Bank and you're lending it out at the same time. That doesn't make any sense.
I fully agree. It should stop, but I don't think it'll make a difference to their behavior.
But it's also $1 billion. It used to be 2.7 up until 2017. If you add it up over the years, I think they're the bank's 2nd largest in terms of pools of money after India.
Yeah, I
for
agree.
the
It's
bank,
wrong.
not for their economy.
Right. But when their economy was smaller when this all started, yes, it made a big difference.
Just to be clear, they are not a borrower from the IMF.
Okay.
No.
I'd like to maybe open the floor a little bit for the audience to ask some questions, or if you have any comments on this. And then I have, just so think about it, but I also wanted to go back to the, this tool that USAID is developing on transparency. How do you hope to, complement the work that the IMF is doing and, others with this tool? And what are the hopes for,
So USAID, I think, is pushing,
coverage?
and they have a fantastic new economist named Dean Carlin that are pushing towards using more evidence and better documentation of what the debt is and what actually works in these countries, and they're really driving the agenda forward Any time one develops, I think best practice is a tool that helps be more transparent about what is actually happening, what is being documented, where the gaps are, and then hopefully move to broader best practices like remove human intervention from procurement, or at least move to the equivalent of congressional budget offices. And really, it's part of a broader approach that I think we see early steps on that needs to happen, which is you safeguard your investments through transparency, through calling out China. You ask about what are the leverage points that we have. I think China is very interested in maintaining, I don't think it's an accident that they maintain a relatively high level of opaqueness around their investments. Mm-hmm. One of the leverage points is to bring those out into the light and to really show, give a choice. I think USAID's approach to that has been, they call it clear choice. Like, here's how we do it. We're transparent, and these are our conditions. We lend through the World Bank, for example, 27 years, 1% or so, or you could go 4% for 10 years with China. Sure, they at some point.
No strings attached.
But the politician will take,
the politician will take it, but then the politician will get arrested when they find, a vault of cash in his apartment in Lagos. So we have to take those steps, and this tool is a first step, and it's part of a broader package of sort of pushing more public financial management transparency that the fund has been explicit in saying, and I think it bears mentioning, the fund delivers the best sort of technical assistance in the world, but it does so in a very short-term basis. It is not really an institution that could sustain support for the fund is a lending institution. Mm-hmm. They make their money, their mission is to lend money, get out there, save these countries. You're the central bank, you're kind of the lender of last resort for central banks. So there's a very important technical assistance function to get these countries to do the right thing, but when you really want to instill a change, you have to call someone like USAID to set up an office and do the real, groundwork of getting local people involved and capacity building. That's what these aid agencies are fantastic at, and it's a 3 to 5 year effort, and that this tool is a very small sort of contribution to a larger effort at the agency to make that happen, to drive, because it's our portfolio that needs to be. These are desperately poor countries. Again, we're not. I gave you the example of McGovern Dole is a very important program because it provides school lunches. You could easily imagine a crisis where the country is defaulting, like in Zambia, has a lot of debt, needs to make government cuts. Where are they going to come? They're going to come to the schools and probably to the school lunches. They're not going to cut the teacher's salary. They're probably not pay them for a few months. But I don't see nominal cuts in the teacher's salary. The lunches, they probably 86 those because you have McGovern Dole. And so you can see it.
I was just going to say, I think just one of you on the technical assistance. I mean, the IMF does stay there in these countries. The problem with technical assistance is that they train these finance ministry officials and central bank officials, and then they leave and they go into the private sector. And a lot of the value added then leaves with it, and then they have to train a new set of people. And it's difficult to keep the expertise. There isn't the pay in the private sector. It's in the public sector. It's miserable in these poorer countries, obviously. And once they are trained, they can go into private sector banks or whatever it may be, and then they lose them. But I think one thing I would say more generally, on a sort of somewhat more optimistic note, because this has been a rather depressing discussion in some way, is that Belt and Road lending by the Chinese is reducing. And it's reducing, in my view, because it's a bad business for China.
Well, yeah.
Lending money to poor countries that can't pay you back and overburdening them with debt is obviously not good business. And so I think the Chinese are perhaps understanding that what they've been doing makes no sense. That's my hope, that they will learn over time to be more restrained in their lending. But obviously, when they do lend, they don't lend responsibly.
And to your point on projects, there's a lot of all these projects from BRI that are not really materializing as well. So to your point, so.
Can I just
Yeah.
weigh in and be the skunk at the picnic again? So I'm going to take the pessimistic view of Mark's optimistic story, which is, so if the Chinese are reducing their BRI lending, which they are, it creates a vacuum for where is additional development finance going to come from. And no matter how much we talk about AID, Development Finance Corporation, any of the US G7 support systems, they are dwarfed by the needs on the development side by these countries. So China has played a role not only because it has served their interest, but to be very clear, it has served the interest of the countries that need development finance. So if you go back, one of the reasons that there's such a antagonistic view towards the Chinese asking the MDBs to take a hit on debt restructuring or debt relief now is because how we got here was HIPC and MDRI, which, if you go back, was intended to create a relatively debt-free starting point for the private sector to come in and impose private sector discipline on countries, but also create a very attractive landscape for the private sector to come in. If you've got these countries that have zero debt stock, that's actually very attractive. What happened was China said, ooh, I want some of that. And now you have this balance of the private sector and China, both of which are running to the hills because they're saying, wow, they can't pay us back. So it's not just BRI that is reducing, it's also the private sector where you've seen emerging market and frontier market capital outflows. So now these countries are saying, okay, what do we do now? Not just to repay the debt, but what do we do about ongoing development financing needs? So again, the aid programs that you're discussing are great, but you could add a zero to them, and it still doesn't make a dent relative to what they really need. And that's where we are all stuck. Where do you get the development finance these countries need?
And let me jump on the pessimistic bandwagon
Team pessimistic on this
Friday.
side, team optimistic.
and say that the current monetary policy of the United States is not boding well for the private sector stepping into frontier markets. Whatever is there has, frankly, I think, been a fantastic development, but to some extent a product, I think we can safely say, of the search for yields. And I think the search for yields is over, and now it's the search for safety. And you are going to have a real hit on these countries when the leverage cycle, to use John Giannakopoulos' term, kicks in and people say, yeah, the interest rate, but also I don't want to be leveraged. I want more collateral. I want safer investments. I want less risk. Because when the interest rate moves up, it's not just you get a better payment in the United States, it's that everything gets riskier. It's just a bad idea to be out there. Because at high interest rates, you're going to have a recession, you're going to have a slowing of the economy, and the U.S. is going to catch a cold, and Africa is going to get pneumonia, and you're going to be the guy who's making 1% more than what the Fed is paying, and that turns out to be a really bad idea. So there is a real risk aversion effort, correction that is coming. So let me buttress your pessimistic point.
Just to bring it back to the theme of the day, which is, so why do we have high interest rates? Because we spent like drunken sailors, to stimulate the economy, thanks to what? COVID, which came from China. Enough said.
Allegedly.
So
Allegedly.
Really?
I think DJ, we were talking yesterday about the Doing Business survey of the World Bank, and which I still think is a tremendous tool that identifies the performance of countries and how they can improve to be more attractive competitively to investors. And I think, Doug, your point is well taken. The solution is private sector investment, but we have these countries, we have to work with these countries and persuade them to become more attractive to foreign investment. There's vastly more private sector capital in the world than even Chinese capital. So the money is there. And that's what I remember sitting down with one of the African executive directors of the IMF and saying, look, you're 150th in the doing business survey. Fix this, get to 100 even, and you'll get more capital. And that, I think, is a big issue that needs to be, that we can provide technical assistance.
Absolutely.
And everything else
And we
there.
can tie it to
And it's
aid.
not that expensive to help them reduce regulation, to improve laws, all these things that will encourage investment. And a lot of the investment shouldn't come in as debt. It should come in as equity investing. I mean, a very small example, I know it's small, but it was a mining investment in Zambia made by the Gates, I think it was actually made personally by Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. I don't know if you guys saw this. It was they bought a mine in Zambia. They spent $600 million on, and they bought it in conjunction with the Zambian government. And they're going to develop this under sound environmental standards, et cetera, et cetera. Look, it's small, but it's an example of what needs to happen.
And I once heard in one of these conversations that, the World Bank and other, bilaterals should have a new KPI, which is really how much money did you mobilize from the private sector.
Absolutely.
So within staff, that should be not the amount of the deal, but how much money you brought in from, how much did you leverage from the private sector. And on a positive note, we have a new president of the World Bank, who I believe comes from the private sector. And I think maybe that, that's a reason why he was chosen, so to bring in, his expertise and really make the World Bank more, partner more with the private sector and try to fill that, humongous gap, which, Doug, you're right. I mean, China offers something that the West and other like-minded partners are not offering. So there is an opportunity. On a more positive note, I'm from Argentina, so it's in my DNA to be a negative and pessimistic. And I have, my parents are Ukrainian, so that's like a double whammy. And so, but on a positive note, I think, maybe going forward, this is going to be, the vision of Mr. Banga. So we have some minutes left on the conversation, so I'd like to maybe invite the audience. We have a good audience today, given it's Friday. So, and there are mics. There's a mic over there. So please, if you want to make a comment or ask a question, please introduce yourself and be brief. It's over there. Over there.
Over there.
Over there. Do you want to make a question? Yes. Sorry. It's
Long walk.
Yeah, no, it's on.
Yeah, it's working.
yeah.
Well, good afternoon. I wanted to.
What's
Jose
your
Pineda
What's your
from
name?
DebTech.
Sorry.
Jose
Name and
Pineda
affiliation.
From DebTech. I wanted to go back to the point of how reasonable it is for China to take the position of not, getting any write-off and just extending the maturity. And if this is reasonable, why is not reasonable for all partners, of all actors? And if that will be an option for everyone, what could be the equivalent of maturity that will be the equivalent of a sizable haircut? Because I think, to me, it seems like a little bit not only unfair in the point that you make, but I think it's impractical. And if we make that calculation, we will see how impractical it is with the level of maturity that will be the equivalent of a haircut.
I actually think that's not a bad solution. First of all, you can lower rates, lower the interest rate on the debt and extend the maturities. And it does have a dramatic impact on net present value. So I think it is a feasible solution. It's one that I think the World Bank is investigating. I saw David Malpass spoke at the Council on Foreign Relations a few weeks ago, and he said he was focusing on NPV, and therefore this particular way of reducing debt burdens. So I think it is a way forward that we should investigate and examine. It worked for Greece. Why should it not work in other situations as well? That's my view.
Can I just say, so it works sometimes and it doesn't work in others. And the Chinese are saying extend, but if you're a private creditor, the NPV hit on the extension can be worse than taking a principal-based haircut and moving on. And the Chinese are worried about principal protection. If you're a private investor, you're worried about net present value calculation. So the balance is both as between creditors, but also as to what the debt servicing needs are and what the debt stock looks like for any given country. So it's a case-by-case situation. And just to push back on Mark, I was on the board during the Greek crisis. There were 2 private sector devaluations, restructurings that managed to impact. The first one was an 83% principal write-off. The second one was almost the equivalent. So you're right, at the bilateral level on the third Greek program, it was an extension. But in what led up to that, there was a massive write-down of Greek debt that was held by the private sector. So you can get there, depending on what your debt profile looks like, both in terms of who the creditors are and what the debt maturity schedule is and what it looks like. But it's not as if happy days are not here again that we found a magic bullet, let's just extend forever. I mean, when I was a banker many years ago, we used to joke about the so-called zero coupon perpetual, which allowed you to actually keep the debt as, we didn't touch the principal. It just never has to get repaid. And it's a console, that's right. And one of the motivations behind that is in China, one of the reasons they have such an aversion to accepting a principal reduction is because under Chinese Communist Party ideology, dating back to the era of Mao Zedong, if you were a state official and you were found guilty of squandering or losing state assets, it was a capital offense, subject to execution. I think it was beheading, maybe it was hanging, whatever it was. There's a continuing aversion, if you're a technocrat in China, to accepting a principle-based haircut, because there's still lingering in the back of your mind that might not end up for you very well.
I would add a small caveat to this. I think the answer is that it's in the numbers and we would have to have a look at it. However, my concern would be that the capacity to make a wise decision on a country-by-country level on the basis of what I have seen is very low, and you are going to pit debt management offices such as they exist in some of these very impoverished countries against highly sophisticated players.
No, but the IMF gets involved in these situations.
But the fund gets involved, but the fund has its, the fund, listen, they raised me, but they have an agenda. They need to strike a deal, and they need to be fair, but they need to get macroeconomic things going and so on. The country needs ownership. The fund is all about country ownership. They need to get their people out there. They need to get their people managing debt in a wise way. And we would never, as the United States, hand the keys over to the fund and say, hey, what should we do about, managing maturity at the Treasury? Not on our worst day. So, we should expect the Zambians or the people of Chad or wherever to take ownership, which is very much on the fund's agenda, and drive this. And develop a debt management office and handle these issues and come to because they are facing creditor committees. The creditor committee of Zambia is chaired by China and France. And so here we go. I mean, they are disarmed. They are, and you can't rely on the fund. The fund is going to do a quarterly review. They're going to be fantastic. You're going to send the best people in the world there, but they're going to be there on a 2-3 week mission every 90 days. At best, and then you have your peripatetic advisor coming in. They can't substitute for a Ministry of Finance. They can't substitute for the upstream management at the Ministries of Health and Education and Investment, the Ministry of Mines. All of those things is really, because I think there may be a solution around NPV reduction perhaps, but my God, they have, that is a sophisticated answer if you have to go case by case and you don't have the capacity on the ground. It's brutal. From what I have seen.
So I know we haven't solved this complicated issue, but what can we learn from this messy situation going forward for the international community, for the IFIs and others. Last parting thoughts. Maybe I'll start with Mark. To
I
wake
think
you up.
we, just summarizing what I've said today, I think continuing, hearing what Doug says, name and shaming doesn't work, but I think we have to continue to do it. We have to threaten lending into arrears. We have to look at using rolling the debt forward and looking at NPV solutions, because I think that could be a fruitful outcome. We have to improve technical assistance. I agree with you that it makes sense to do that and to strengthen these government institutions within the countries. I do believe, however, that the IMF doesn't just go every 90 days. They're constantly consulting with these government agencies of these countries all the time. They're not just leaving them to it every 90 days. So they are a strong advocate for these countries in these debt restructuring discussions. So that's a combination of different things. And we have to try to improve the quality of the investing environment in these countries so that they attract more equity capital and less debt, more foreign direct investment. That's what we need. I think if we can do all of those things, then hopefully we'll come back in a year or two's time in a more optimistic frame of mind.
Okay, DJ?
I don't really have much else to add. It's a long list. I would just say, particularly on the private sector side, that's supposed to be what IFC does at the World Bank, which is going in and seeding that private capital. They're going in and they're directly investing in these local companies, and then that's supposed to crowd in, more private investment. Maybe with Banga's background, that will be an effort, a focus for him. A lot of the IFC projects that I saw didn't make any sense. It was like the 19th fish farm in China. Why? It's the same company, the 19th fish farm. It's just like, again, they shouldn't be in China to begin with, but and if you're worried about the environment, fish farms are really, really bad for the environment. There's a part of the World Bank, also MIGA, which is political risk insurance, more of the private sector should be going there. The United States, unfortunately, a lot of our companies just don't have that kind of risk tolerance. We've sort of talked about corruption. I think a lot of our companies are at a disadvantage because of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So, I think it's great. I wish every country had the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but, I'll hit on France again. But I think a lot of these countries, they want, U.S. investment, they want American companies there because we're not corrupt. But we need to, try to get more of our companies interested in doing that and make it less risky for them.
Doug?
I'll pick up on some of the points and then add to them. This is supposed to be about transparency. I'm going to say re-emphasize the need for transparency. I think it's impossible to create a debt environment favorable to any of the alternative sources of capital, official or private, if you don't know what you're lending into. And so I think we just keep on doubling down on the need for that. I said earlier, I think the World Bank in particular deserves a huge amount of credit for its database on debt. It right now is limited to DSSI countries. I would try and expand that and update it and make sure that countries know that they've got to comply with it. Second thing, by the way, in the private sector as well, the IIF and the OECD have a sovereign debt database they're trying to put together, which is voluntary, but which is important for the private creditors to try and self-report. Isn't going so well because private creditors don't like to do that, but I think that's part of the overall transparency need to improve everybody's game. I would double down on what we've all been talking about, which is tough rhetoric on lending into official arrears and others calling out China. It's not that I said it doesn't work as a means by which to say don't do it. I'm just saying it hasn't worked. That doesn't mean don't keep trying. And in fact, I think as the example I gave of Sri Lanka, when you have countries like India that are global competitors to China in a different way than the US is, that works. or it works a lot better than if it's just the U.S. hectoring. So I think getting allies to publicly call out China as well is probably a good thing. Sources of development finance from the G7. If we could get our collective act together to create a big pool of development finance, then we would have something to be able to go in with countries and say, look, you don't need to take the money from China. You can take it from us. Mark, when you were on the board, we had the effort to make the DFC useful in Ecuador. But the amounts were trivial relative to Ecuador's overall position. It was extremely well-intentioned, but the numbers just aren't there. So,
Like fund the PGII, right?
yeah, the PGII and more.
Okay.
And I appreciate the fact you called it PGII and not piggy, because they don't like it when you say piggy, because it sounds pretty bad. So I thought I'd throw that in,
So you
so
say it
that
again.
don't use piggy.
PGII.
Okay, right, okay. And the last thing is, this administration has made a big initiative for a multilateral development bank reform. They have lowered the need for the World Bank to hold reserves from 20% to 19%
Right.
as a means by which to free up, I think it's $5 billion a year more. On a global scale, is that a lot? No. As an incremental step, is it good? Yes. So I think looking at other sources of capital so that we actually put our money where our mouth is what we really need to do.
Good.
I think, first of all, I think this panel recognizes something that is probably not at the forefront of the broader community, which is that there is a very big storm coming to the lowest income countries in the world. There's 60% of them at risk. We have eroded the position that we had after HIPC, and that is over, and we are not going to be able to do a new HIPC. And so this is about transparency, and if I could just put a very simple marker that ties everything we've talked about together, which is the USA developed these roadmaps for the very countries that are going into a crisis, and one of the signs, one of the indicators of the journey to self-reliance, which is now called the country roadmaps, was the IMF's debt sustainability sufficient statistic. I forget which one they picked out of the DSA. But the IMF World Bank joint debt sustainability analysis framework is the basis of everything that goes forward when one of these countries gets a crisis. It is how you map its way out. It is what determines financing and lending into arrears. It is how much the country actually has capability to repay. It's the answer. And until we see that developing countries can do this on command by themselves, because I agree, the IMF, it's not that they go away and they forget about it, it's that they do the DSA when they're there, and that is the official DSA. But a week later, things changed. You know what I mean? Oil prices moved. A new creditor steps forward. Oops, we discovered more debt. All of these things won't be updated in the IMF debt sustainability analysis until the fund comes back officially. But if you look at how the United States, even Puerto Rico, which we worked on, they do DSAs on command every 3 minutes. Oh, we need another one. Oh, what about this scenario? And so on. Until that capacity is out there, and until we have, and that is a great tool because it encompasses everything. It encompasses, do you have transparency around debt? Have you had a cattle call around everybody who you owe money to? Is there anything hidden? What are the flows? What are the external financing flows that are available? How much is the gap? Until that is a widely understood tool for all of the people who are involved in financing these low-income countries, we haven't finished the job on debt transparency, on capacity building, on safeguarding the investments of the United States in these poorest of poor countries, and on really countering the malign influence mission that the broader diplomatic and defense communities have, on countering BRI, on all of that, because it is all being hidden in this world of no transparency and sort of let's work really hard to find out where China has lent. So I'll end on that.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for coming today, and especially our distinguished panel. So please join me in a round of applause.